Hi everybody, I'm Pia from Stitches and Scraps, and today I'm going to show you how to sew these seams on the Unbiased Pillow. I've gone ahead and removed the pillow form so we can at least work our first seam with the project flat. So to make this, we're folding over the corners to the inside here, and to line it up, look at these ridges here, these stripes of garter ridges. What we're going to do is we're going to line up the whole section with that other section from the other side, which means that this single row of garter stitch is going to line up with the top of this triple row of garter stitch, so that it ends up like this over here, where it switches from 1 row to 3 rows and 1 row to 3 rows. So once we've got that lined up, and here's another one down here, now we know that our seam is centered. Don't worry too much about the center part here, because that'll pull together as we sew. That's how I know that I've folded it properly. So now let's go ahead and sew the seam. I like working from the center out, so I have rotated my piece and I'm going to work this way first. I might even turn this a little bit more and work across this way. Now, if it helps you to keep everything lined up, you can go ahead and put stitch markers in here to kind of pin things together. It's not absolutely necessary, but if it helps you, feel free. And normally I would be sewing this in with these ends that I've left here for seaming, but so that you can see it better, I'm going to do a little bit in this bright green so that it shows up really well on camera. Now I want to show you the difference between this edge here and this edge here. And I'm going to zoom in just a little bit more so you can see it really well. On these two sections here, we were doing increases. So we have, here's our garter edge, and then we have these little diagonal lines from the increases. Do you see that? And on this edge here, we were doing decreases. So we have, here's our garter, which is kind of tucked underneath, and we have this full V shape on the edge. So this seam that I'm doing is designed to make both of those come out looking the same. It's not necessarily an invisible seam because I didn't want that much bulk at the back. It's sort of using the same technique, but in a way that makes both edges look the same. So let's get started on that. Let's line up our loops so that we know that we're starting in the same spot, and we're going to end with these two stripes lined up. So what we're going to do is we're using these diagonal loops that are here from the increases on both sides just behind the garter stitch selvage. Okay, so we're going to match up the pairs. Here's one pair of diagonal loops. There's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then for 10 I'm going to go right in here, which is right in the corner, and then right here. Okay, so we have 10 loops that we've matched up, and we're going to start working from here. Now every stitch I make, regardless of which side I'm on, is going to go from the outside, so like from this way in and from this way in. So they're going to go towards the seam. So I'm going from the outside here and bringing it in. See how that loops it around like that? Now, where was my loop number 10? Let's count it again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There's my loop number 10. So I'm going this way. See, from out away from the seam towards the seam. And you can see how that loops it around. And you should get a loop that goes around it. So it shouldn't be this way. It shouldn't go straight through. Now let's keep doing that for the rest of our 10 loops that we had. That one. So this is very much like a invisible seam that you would work vertically in knitting, but it's not quite invisible because we're not working into stitches back here. We're working into the into these increases that we had done. So it's going to actually show a little bit. It's not going to be completely invisible. It's kind of like lacing up shoes, this back and forth motion. Well, depending on how you lace your shoes. I've seen some really creative ways of lacing shoes. So now after you get about halfway, make sure you're still lined up. So these two, these two, these two, these two. So I'm still lined up. Oh, did I skip one? No, I think I'm good. And that completes the stockinette section. So now we've made our 10 little joins, and that's pretty ugly, right? Here's the magic of this kind of join. When I pull on this, the green is going to disappear. See how it straightens out? And it pulls those stitches together, and it just disappears. Now, if I was using the same color thread, you would barely be able to see this at all. And now I've got a nice tight center, and I've got the stockinette section done. And now I'm to this garter section. Now the garter section is fun because sometimes you have garter stitch and sometimes you have stockinette stitch. So sometimes like here you have garter to garter, here you have garter to garter, but in between this is all garter to stockinette and it gets really funky, right? Well, very simply, we are still going to work one loop on this side and one loop on this side. When we're talking about garter, you notice that each row or each ridge in garter has two sets of loops. There's one on the top, one on the bottom. You're going to pick a side, and it doesn't matter which one you pick. One side you're going to work into the top loops, and one side you're going to work into the bottom loops. Now for me, I tend to go that the side that I work onto first, I'm going to work in the top bump, and the side that I work onto second, I'm going to work in the bottom bump. Now, I just finished working a stitch onto this piece, so my first side is going to be here, which means that my top bump is here. Okay? With the garter stitch, we're going to keep working in this direction, again, right to left here. Okay? So this one goes in like that, and then this one, I want the bottom, right? So this is my garter stitch selvage right here. And this is the closest bottom loop that I can work into past the selvage. Actually, that might be an increase, which is fine. On this side, we can work into the increase here too. So I'm going into this loop here, okay? And then I hit stockinette. Well, we know how to work into stockinette, right? Now I know that each ridge in garter is actually 2 rows, but for the purposes of our seaming here, we're going to match up every 2 rows of garter with 1 row of stockinette. So here I work into this loop, remember the diagonal loops, and again towards the seam. And then I'm going to work vertically into this bottom loop on the garter. And then again into this next, see I came out of that loop before, so now I'm going into this one on this next row of stockinette. And then into this one on the garter. So now I've matched up 2 rows of garter with 2 rows of stockinette. And you want to stop every so often and pull your seam tight just to lock it in place. Now I'm over to this section of garter, and on this side I have stockinette. Same thing, but except this time I'm working in top loops. Okay, so top loop here and through, and then this way on this first diagonal line on the stockinette. Top loop here and this way on this line of the stockinette. Okay, there's 2 more rows, and now I've got the last row of garter on each side, so top loop here and bottom loop here. And when I pull that tight, there goes that seam. Okay, and again, you're going to be doing it in the color that matches, so it will blend, but you can see that we have no puckering and we have these lined up nice and tight. Okay, now we're back to the stockinette section. I'm going to do this fast because you guys have already seen this. So make sure we're lined up properly. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, that one's tight, 8, 9, 10. All right, and I'm starting on this side, so 1, and there is another stockinette section done. Are you ready for the fun part? Woo! There it goes. Awesome. Okay, so I will show you this section again too, just because I want to get to the very corner so you can see how that looks. And then I'll pull this out and I want to show you the difference on the other side. So first we've got garter to garter. So I'm going top loop, bottom loop, nice and easy. Then we have garter to stockinette, so I'm going, well, stockinette to garter, so I'm going vertical line, bottom loop, vertical line, or diagonal line, I guess, bottom loop. Okay? Then we've got garter to stockinette, so I'm going top loop and diagonal line, top loop and diagonal line. And then on my last row of garter, I'm going top loop and bottom loop. Now we've come to the really fun part, this tiny little fold here. Well, just as best as you can, match up the diagonal parts of your stockinette stitch here, and it'll get you close enough to the end that if you're off a little bit, it's not going to matter once you weave in your tail. There's one more. There and there. And let's see if I can find one more loop on each side. There. And that's it. Anything more is too much. So that's my last section. Pull it all tight. And there we have the finished seam on this side. Okay, now I'm going to pull that out, do the seam in my regular color, and then come back and show you with this green again how to do this side where it's a little bit different over here. I have zoomed out because I want to show you something cool. And don't do this too often because it will wear on your yarn. But if I pull out that center bit that I did, right, because that part was different, this seam that I've done can be pulled out really easily all in one piece. If I grab the end here, and sorry you can see my tripod in the picture, but if I grab the end here and I just ease it through, there we go, see? Just ease it through a little bit, kind of like you're gathering, right? You do a little bit at a time. It will just pull right out and the seam is gone. You can see where the stitches were linked to each other, but the seam holding them together is gone. So it's very easy to pull out if you make a mistake. Just don't do it that way very often because it will wear on the yarn and you'll end up tearing your yarn. I finished that seam and now I've pulled this inside out real quick just to show you what the seams look like on the inside. These are not flat seams. You can see that those garter stitch selvages that we did have been pushed to the inside of the work. So it's really pretty and flat on the outside, but you do have these ridges on the inside. So now we've done 3 of the seams. Before we do the 4th seam, you want to make sure that you weave in all your ends because that way you only have the one end left to weave in after you finish your seam. So let me flip this back the right way around and put the pillow in, and then we'll finish the last seam. So I've got my pillow in and I've got my thread anchored in the center. And again, I'm using this color just so you can see it. I would be using a normal, the normal tail otherwise. So now this lines up a little differently than this did. This section we started with stockinette all the way across, and in this section we're actually starting with garter. So let's zoom in and take a look at how that works. Okay, so right at the tip of this triangle here, there is one little stitch of garter right up at the tip here, right here. So we're going to connect that one to this first row of garter here. So I'm again going to go down and find my bottom loop here, which is, let's go right there, that one, down. Okay, there's my first stitch. Now I've got the 2 rows of stockinette, and here's where it gets a little different, and I'm going to show you with here. We don't have just the diagonal line anymore. Now we have this whole V, right? But if we turn the V slightly, we can count this loop of the V as those diagonal lines and work with those just like we did before. So I've connected my garter to garter. Now I'm going to do 2 rows of stockinette to garter. So find that V shape, there's one, there's the other, and get this inside loop, the one closest to your work, not closest to the selvage, and go through that. And then the bottom loop on this side again. Okay, outside loop here, and bottom loop here. Now this is the seam I'm using, but you can use any seam that you'd like on this pillow because the seam is actually part of the decorative element of the back of the pillow. So you may want to do something more decorative. You may want to do a crocheted seam or I don't know, just something more decorative. You may want to do a seam on the wrong side, like a whip stitch seam that lets that garter stitch edge show through. But I liked this one for the simplicity and cleanness of it. And it's very much like doing an invisible seam, it's just not invisible. So now we go outside loop, outside loop. This one's easy. The stockinette part goes really fast. It's the garter ridges where you have to pay a little more attention. It's easier to find your loops on this side too, isn't it? Because you've got those V's to work with. We're so used to working with V-shaped things. I split the yarn there, but let's take that out. You don't want to split the yarn. It'll put too much stress on it and it can break it. So try to avoid splitting the yarn where you can. Okay, there. All right, and then pull it tight again. And go on to the next section. Now when you're pulling like that, don't pull it so tight that the fabric cinches. You want to pull it tight so that it's flat, but you want to hold the opposite end and pull it apart too. Make sure it's nice and even, not super tight, right? Okay, so now I've got garter and garter for one row, so top bump and bottom bump. Yes, bottom bump. Now I've got garter and stockinette, or stockinette and garter, so stockinette goes into that stitch and garter goes into the bottom bump, stockinette, bottom bump. Now I've got garter into stockinette, so I go top bump. The reason I'm being careful here is because the selvage is garter stitch, so it's kind of hard to distinguish the garter stitch from the garter stitch, selvage, but try to stay one stitch in from the selvage so that your seam doesn't become uneven. So now I've got my last row of garter and garter. And then I'm back to stockinette. So let's tighten this section. Oopsie, I cinched it a little too much. There we go. We're getting close to the end here, guys. Here is, I shouldn't say guys, because not all of you are guys, but I mean that in a non-gender specific sort of way. We're getting close to the end here, friends. Let's say that. There we go. Okay. So now we're at the funky part at the end, which is the garter stitch stripe against the garter stitch and stockinette here. Just remember the pattern that we had up here. Okay, the pattern that we had up here. We first have one row of garter stitch against garter stitch. So there's that. Then we have 2 rows of stockinette against garter stitch. So there's one. And this one will bring us right to the end, and just find a bump. Don't worry if it's top or bottom or what, but just find a bump and go into the bump. And make sure as you do that you're kind of opening this and pushing. Remember how we saw that garter stitch edge went to the inside? Make sure you're pushing it to the inside so it doesn't stick out. And that's it. The pillow is seamed. Well, I'm going to rip this out and do it in the same color, but the pillow is seamed. And now, if you don't like the way the center looks and you want something decorative, you can stick a button on it. I don't have a button to show you right now, but I've got a quarter, so I'll show it to you with a quarter. If you were to sew a quarter into the middle, you can either do it just solid like this, which is what I like because I don't want to disturb the pattern on the other side, or you could sew straight down through it like that and make the pillow pucker on both sides so you get that shape. Whichever way you prefer is fine. Do either one. You may even not want I'm saying a quarter. You may even not want a button at all. You may be fine with it just the way it is. And in fact, I kind of like mine just the way it is. So I'm not going to add a button, but you certainly can. And that's it for seaming the unbiased pillow. Now you want to know why I call it unbiased? I call it unbiased because I knit it on the bias, right? On the bias means on the diagonal. So I knit it on the bias and I had a square with diagonal stripes, but then I folded it on the bias. And you know what happens when you take something that's worked on the bias and then you fold it on the bias? It's no longer diagonal. Now it's straight, so you've unbiased it. I know that's cheesy, but that's where the name came from. So if you enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up, share it with your friends, or leave me a comment. You can also subscribe to my YouTube channel for more great videos. Thanks for watching.